If we really want to think on a Canadian geopolitical angle, and we think the Arctic is a very important part of Canada's role in international security, then we have to pay a lot of attention to Russia. Just because of the war in Ukraine, because of the rise of China, China's interference in our politics, etc., can't let us take our eye off the ball that Russia is the pacing challenge for Canada in the Arctic.
Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Christopher Coates, the Director of Foreign Policy, National Defence and National Security here at MLI. Canadians sense that the Arctic is a part of their identity, but few are deeply familiar with the region, its environment, its vastness, its diversity, or its challenges. The importance of the Arctic is increasing, both for Canada and for our allies. So better understanding the region is critical. To that point, understanding the Russian Arctic, very different than the Canadian Arctic, is critical. Given the role of Russia as a destabilizing geopolitical actor and as NATO's principal adversary. Today's guest with me is MLI Senior Fellow Alex Dalziel. Alex is an Arctic expert with significant experience in the Canadian Arctic, the Nordic region, as well as the challenges of the Russian Arctic. He has considerable experience, including 20 years working in Canada's national security, intelligence, and foreign policy communities, and speaks Russian, French, and Finnish. We'll be doing this today in English, thankfully. Alex, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Christopher.
Yeah. Alex, I'd like to start with a question about icebreakers. Canada recently announced a plan to accelerate icebreaker production. In June, I was in Finland, the country where between 60 and 80% of the world's icebreakers are designed and built. And I visited Arctia, who operate about a third or a half of the world's icebreakers. I toured one of their heavy icebreakers. And Russia just announced that they're about to build their 8th nuclear-powered icebreaker, the only nuclear icebreakers in the world. If Russia is now building their 8th nuclear icebreaker, what are they using it for? And is Canada doing too little, too late?
Mm-hmm. So certainly the Russian icebreaker fleet is the largest in the world. As you mentioned, the nuclear icebreakers, as well as a very large conventional, powered fleet. So what are they using it for? Well, that's been the subject of what we've been doing in this Russian Grand Strategy in the Arctic project. There's commercial drivers and there's political drivers. So commercially, they're trying to open up what's called the Northern Sea route so that they can move oil and gas primarily, but also minerals and to some extent goods across this route, which extends from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean through across Russia's northern coast. So this is an area that still has considerable ice conditions for much of the year. It certainly has been because of climate change melting and is more accessible, but it's still a very difficult place to navigate. So they're trying to be able to make sure to open that route for as long as possible. And that takes the world's most powerful icebreakers, certainly for chunks of the year. But underneath all that, of course, there's a national security and a geopolitical aim. And projecting power in the Arctic Ocean, ensuring that Russia is the most powerful Arctic state, is one of the reasons they are doing this sort of development.
Interesting. You mentioned the project that you're working on. Can you talk a little bit more about this project, what was behind it, and what the objectives were?
Yeah, well, when it comes to the Arctic, as you mentioned, Russia's a big player. They're doing a lot, as I just said. They want to be the main player there. So we thought it would be a good idea to develop a project looking not just at Russia's military developments, some of the things that we often focus on as security and geopolitical analysts, but also the kind of geoeconomics, if you will. What is Russia doing to strengthen its economic capabilities in the north, and how is it integrating that with its national security? So this was embarked upon, because in part some of the challenges is that we're in a media environment where China, the challenge from China China is talked about a lot. For the United States, this is the primary challenge. But if we really want to think on a Canadian geopolitical angle, and we think the Arctic is a very important part of Canada's role in international security, then we have to pay a lot of attention to Russia. Just because of the war in Ukraine, because of the rise of China, China's interference in our politics, et cetera, can't let us take our eye off the ball that Russia is the pacing challenge for Canada in the Arctic.
Thanks. You published two papers recently as part of the work on this project, Alex. You just mentioned now that the focus of the study is on sort of the geoeconomics and what Russia is doing and planning for in the Arctic. Can you talk about some of the key findings that appeared in the paper that you found during the research?
Yeah, so the two papers you're mentioning, Frozen Assets and Polar Power, one looks at the Arctic Ocean seabed, and Russia considers this part of what it calls its strategic resource base. And again, this idea is really connected to geopolitics and national security. Russia wants to be able to exploit both the territory within its exclusive economic zone, the EEZ, that you'll hear talked about quite a bit, but also has these aspirations for an extended continental shelf claim and the use of seabed that's in international waters. So what do they want to do there? Well, when you look at their strategic documents, what the Russian government, Putin, and his circles are saying to the Russian people, to the Russian media, to the world, they're still very much focused on hydrocarbons. The Barents Sea region in the most western parts of the Russian Arctic is one of the major areas for oil and gas extraction. Certainly the Yamal Peninsula, exporting this, getting it out is a key point, and they still see a future heavily focused on oil and gas. But they're not putting all their eggs in that basket. They're also looking at seabed mining, which would be very, very challenging in the Arctic. But they're doing a lot of the preliminary work there to get a better sense of where it might be possible to extract minerals. Notably, some of this is being done in cooperation with Chinese scientists from the PRC. So, we see this activity, and Russia is very, very aggressive, even when it obeys international law. It's really pushing for a maximal take here on where it can extract resources, and it's trying to build the military and security resources to protect that. So as I mentioned, it's great to extract this stuff from the Arctic, but you also need to get it out. So the second paper, Polar Power, is focused on the Northern Sea Route. And really the main takeaway, I think, there is that the Northern Sea Route isn't just a maritime link from Russia to the rest of the world, or for the rest of the world through the Russian sea lanes to the north, but is really an infrastructure backbone. They're really trying to build a network of ports, airports, human habitation, search and rescue infrastructure, in some cases industries, and certainly connect the mines and the oil fields and the natural gas fields to a whole network of infrastructure that's designed to keep Russians in the north, attract Russians to live in the north. And crucially, I think, we don't even need to think purely about the Arctic here. This is about accessing the Siberian, the interior of Siberia and all the resources there. There's a lot of planning around river development, making sure the rivers kind of connect to the Northern Sea Route. So and also the train routes that connect between these and elsewhere. So it is really about creating infrastructure that connects not just the Russian Arctic, but the whole of Russia together through the Arctic. And I would say, Christopher, that is a big geopolitical change, in the world. The fact that the Arctic Ocean, the Arctic coastline of Russia is becoming a key point of how this country, Russia, interacts with the world.
Interesting. I want to come back to that and why it matters for Canada, but just for a moment, do you think that all of this is connected to climate change in some way, or was this a long-term objective for Putin and the Russian regime?
Well, certainly in their lifetime, of course, they've dealt with the reality of climate change and a warming north for a long time. If you go back to the Soviet time, the Arctic was very, very important. I mean, obviously for the nuclear submarine fleet, the Russia is one of the navies that can operate under the ice. But there's, I think, little question that the warming of the north the reduction in sea ice is what is enabling this. I think the important thing for listeners to take away is that this isn't really linear, and this remains a difficult environment. Mobile sea ice moving around, drifting. I mean that's almost as big a challenge in some ways as plowing through it. So it certainly does relate to changes in the climate. But it also relates, I would say, too, to things that are changing in the world's economy when it comes to technology, et cetera. The drive for both critical minerals, energy sources, and secure supply. Security of supply, secure supply chains is as much an issue for the Russians. The Russians want to be part of that for their partners. They don't really have allies, but for the people they work with, who they sell to, as much as it's become for Canada and its NATO partners.
Okay, if we go back to the North Sea route, and you described how for Russia it becomes more than just a maritime corridor, but a way of connecting the Russian Arctic to the rest of the world, a way for them to enter the marketplace with the various commodities that they might extract from their Arctic. But why does this matter for Canadians then? Why does the Russian approach to their Arctic, to the North Sea route, why does that matter for Canadians?
Yeah, so I think part of the issue is that Russia, is kind of setting itself up in some ways to be the gateway to the Arctic. And Russia, as we've seen in Ukraine, as we've seen through all the hybrid warfare, arson, cable snippings, different things, particularly in Europe, but also concerns about that happening elsewhere, is that Russia becomes the gateway to the Arctic, that Russia sets the standards, that Russia builds the skill sets and the knowledge, and it has enormous amounts of this. Its mariners, its industries are already very capable of operating in the Arctic. So as it does more of this, it builds its capability. And like I've said, this isn't just there may be commercial drivers. There's the interests of Putin and his regime, but at every step, national security is a consideration here. The Russian Navy, in terms of basing in the north, Air Force basing, et cetera. If you look at the security services of Russia, the idea is really to implant all of these things at points all along the Northern Sea route. Russia is going to protect those resources. So I think there's maybe two, kind of core aspects here. One is just what sort of Arctic do we want? Who do we want defining that? Do we want Canada to be leading with its democratic partners to shape that and make sure that the international community is largely working in the Arctic in a way that respects Indigenous rights, that respects environmental considerations, that respects sovereignty? Or do we want, Russia, in many cases partnered with China, being the one that sets the standards? So I think there's some deep questions here about, how we approach our own Arctic. Certainly, there's no reason to emulate what the Russians are doing. But I do think, as part of the current discussion around nation building projects, et cetera, we really want to talk with our American partners, talk with our Greenlandic and Danish neighbors, to talk about not just defending this Arctic when it comes to military assets, but also how do we develop its economy? How do we make it a place where our citizens want to live? How do we develop it in concert with the people who have lived there, for in many cases for millennia, to create our own Arctic model, based on respect for a little more ground up. I think the Russian model is very top down. So yeah, let's kind of think about how our own Arctic develops to make it the model for the world.
In your view, Alex, are those two visions for the Arctic mutually incompatible? A Canadian view of the Arctic as a zone of peace and cooperation, and a Russian zone, as you've outlined, is really a strategic frontier for them. Are those visions incompatible in some way?
Well, I think they're incompatible right now. I mean, until Russia withdraws from Ukraine, ends its war there, it's just simply very, very hard to have the trust relationships to build up. Like, during the Cold War, I mean, there was a lot of mistrust, and yet, many different forms of science and cooperation took place. So, I'm a hopeful person. You look to the future, many things could change, but certainly the trajectory for Russia under the Putin regime, given its hostility to Ukraine, to the organizations like NATO that have brought decades of peace and security to Europe and to the North Atlantic, to Canada and the United States. I think right now our focus needs to be working on cooperation with our Arctic allies in the Nordic countries, Northern Europe, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, and with our neighbors in North America, the United States and Greenland, and as part of the Kingdom of Denmark. So, I think right now we're having a lot of geopolitical competition between different blocs. Hopefully we can get back to a state where Russia is a constructive player in the Arctic, but we're not there yet.
That's great. Just to close this off, if I can tie back to the icebreaker question that we started with, maybe in your article, Polar Power, you state that Canada and the United States need to urgently rebuild their icebreaker fleets and bolster Arctic search and rescue and environmental response capabilities. So from your examination of Russia's North Sea route and their approach, what are the risks and impacts if Canada and the U.S. don't rebuild our icebreaker fleets?
Well, we need to be able to operate there, right? And we need to think about what sort of deterrence strategy, as military planners talk about, we need with Russia, how we position ourselves to respond. I think we need a model that really takes advantage of data integration, data collection. I mean, repeated reports from Parliament and the Senate in Canada have talked about the need for better sensor networks, both for the air and for the sea. And we need better ability to respond. So I'm really looking for Canada. I think we're making some positive steps on the icebreaker construction. I mean, the ice pact between Canada, Finland, and the United States. I mean, certainly the use of Finnish shipyards to accelerate the program. Cooperation between the three countries to talk about how we can work together better is important. North America is a very strong protectionist strand around its maritime shipbuilding industry. So, we need to kind of find ways to be competitive together. I think, my concern, if I had one, Christopher, at this time is that, with Canada's announcement to get to 3.5% on, kind of direct military spending, another 1.5% on defense-related infrastructure, we shouldn't just be racing to spend the money. We need a plan. We need to be thinking that through, and certainly the whole of government approach is crucial in the Arctic. I mean, crucial for, making sure we make every dollar go as far as it can. Making sure that it's meeting the needs of the populations of the Arctic, that it's being done, with a real sense of co-ownership, co-investment with Indigenous Canadians, the Inuit community, and others. I don't want to see us rush on this question, but we do need to give it a lot of seriousness of purpose and really make it, bring together the necessary folks and get a plan together that, make sure we keep moving. So I would say, the urgency is just in the focus, which I think has been lacking in Canada for much of the last couple of decades.
All right. We'll close it off there. Thank you very much, Alex, for all of your insights. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd invite you to like and subscribe. It really helps us to reach more people with these conversations. For MLI, I'm Christopher Coates. Thank you for joining us on Inside Policy Talks.